Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Integrity Matters by Turnitin. My name is Chooks, and with me in the house today is Daniel Braithwaite, Head of Department Science, Carey Baptist College. Hello, Daniel.
Hi, Chuck. Good to be with you today.
Lovely. Today, we're going to be exploring the role of formative and summative assessment. But before we get into that, can you tell us a bit about your professional background and what excites you about the work you do at Carey Baptist College?
I'm currently a head of science at Carey Baptist College, so I head up our secondary science department here. But before teaching, I used to be an engineer, so I worked for about 9 years in engineering, um, and I loved engineering, but I really wanted to do something that was focused also on investing in people. And so I made a career switch to teaching. So I've been teaching now for about 6 years. And so I've really kind of settled into the role of teaching. I really love teaching. And it still feels like I've kind of got one foot in engineering, which I really love. And also, I get this immense privilege of coming into work and investing into the lives of 900 teenagers. And so, there's an old proverb that says it takes a village to raise a child, and I get to be part of the village for these teenagers. And it's a real, it excites me, gets me out of bed every morning. I still get to do my engineering stuff, and I get to, hopefully improve the life outcomes of 900 students.
That's really exciting.
Mm.
I think that proverb, I've always wondered where it came from. Something tells me it's an African proverb, but never know. So today we're looking at the role of formative and summative assessment. I think the best way to begin today's conversation is to give a sense of how we differentiate that. How do you differentiate summative assessment, and in what instances would you be using both of them?
So summative assessment is usually an assessment that occurs at the end of a course of study or a period of time within the study. And really what we're doing is we're assessing a student's achievement against a set of learning outcomes, and it focuses over progress over time. And it's generally low frequency. So you generally don't have lots of them, um, but they are high stakes. And what I mean by high stakes is that they mean that we're assigning a grade to students against those learning outcomes and in many ways against their peers. And so these high stakes assessments can be set by the institution itself. So at our school, we set tests for students after they've, roughly every 5 weeks. But it can also include things like standardized assessments like NAPLAN. And that allows us to compare against schools as well within a national context. Formative assessment, on the other hand, really is occurring during the learning process. So what it does is it allows the teacher to capture the learning as it occurs and make appropriate adjustments to how they're teaching. And so typically formative assessments are high frequency and low stakes. So generally with formative assessments, or at least I think good formative assessments don't have grades attached to them. They're just a way to find out what do my students know and how well do they know it. And the idea of a formative assessment is not to assign a grade, but it's to give teachers the information they need to make accurate, consistent judgments about what their students know at a point in time. And then they're adjusting their teaching according to that. So I think an interesting analogy would be like a formative assessment is like taking a sample test. So if if you're looking at the health of I don't know, there's a science teacher in me with biology, you're looking at the health of a lake or a water system. Your summative assessments is essentially the ongoing judgments that you make every year on how is the health of this system. Your formative assessments are all the little samples you're taking through the year. So you're taking a little water sample every now and again, you're testing the water quality. That's your formative assessments. And then your summative assessments is your, kind of the big report you're writing at the end of the year.
I love the analogies.
Hmm.
Just wondering, are we seeing a move away from summative assessments to more formative assessment, especially with the need to support student learning and enhance their experience?
Sure. So I don't think we're seeing a move away from summative assessments, but we're definitely seeing a move towards formative assessments. So let's just quickly talk about why we're not seeing a move away from summative assessments. So I think summative assessments are a really important tool if they're used correctly. So an example of that is the dreaded NAPLAN that schools use, and for all its problems, what it does is it allows us to compare schools. And when that's done properly, so when it's not done in league tables where parents are comparing school A versus school B, but when that's used by education systems to look at, well, which school is really punching above its weight in literacy, Then we can actually go why. Then we can ask the question why, and then we can go visit that school and see what are they doing in the area of literacy that is really, really making them stand out on the national scale. And maybe we can all learn from some. On at a school level as well, like a really well written summative assessment, what it allows us to do is look at teachers. So in my science department, we may have 5 classes and 5 different teachers teaching a year 8 science. We can use that summative assessment to go which teachers are getting better results in a particular area, and then find out why. What can we learn from that teacher about what they're doing in the classroom that the other teachers can implement and learn from? And so summative assessments really have their place if they used properly. Um, and also, the external demands from education bureaucracy and from parents is grades, right? Everyone wants grades. And so we're not seeing a move away from summative assessments. Possibly we're seeing fewer of them being done. I think maybe we're seeing lower frequency of summative assessments. But what we're definitely seeing in the classroom, at least in the secondary area, is a move towards more formative assessments. And this is also a good thing. So the way I describe what has happened in the past, I think this is for secondary. I want to say at the beginning, for primary schools, I think they're much better than secondary schools at formative assessments. I think when the teacher has a student for the whole day, their ability to judge what students know is incredible. If you've ever been into a primary classroom, there's teachers do some amazing things. But in the secondary school environment, when you're seeing the class for 1 hour per day for 4 days a week, it's much harder to generate judgments on how those students are going. And so what has often happened in secondary schools is that the way when the teacher and the student find out how they've gone when they sit their summative assessments. And so the teacher delivers content and delivers content and delivers content, and then there's a summative test at the end of that. And I think people are starting to say, hold on, that's not good enough. It's not good enough for the teacher and the student to find out how they've gone in something, how well they know something, until they've set a major summative assessment. What we're saying is actually we can improve the learning experience by providing teachers and students with more information as we're learning, so we can make decisions and judgments and changes. And I think it's generally a good thing. And so what we're actually seeing is the ideal is that the formative assessments that are done on a week, say like on a weekly basis, mean that when students and teachers are coming to a summative test, it's really no surprise. The grade that the students are getting shouldn't be a surprise to the students. It really, the students and the teachers should really have a very clear idea of where their students are, how well they know the content, so that when they sit the test, if they're getting an A, that's entirely what they're expecting. And if they've got a D, that's entirely what they're expecting, because the formative process made their learning transparent, right? So I think John Hattie, he's an educational researcher, I think based in Melbourne. He talks about how do we make the learning visible? So how does it visible to the student? How is it visible to the teacher? And really the key way that it's made visible is through formative assessments.
Really good points there. Just
Mhm.
wondering with the move, like you say, towards more formative assessment and maybe less frequency with summative assessment, there must be challenges with regards to design and delivery of these. What are some challenges with for educators when they're designing
Mm.
formative assessment as well as summative assessment?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge is time. So teachers in schools are supremely busy. Um, a standard secondary school teacher would probably teach for 80% of their day, with 20% of their day left for doing everything else. So which is admin, marking, writing assessments. And so you don't get a lot of time. And I think it takes time to write good assessments. But once you've written a good assessment, you have that year on year. What takes more time is marking the assessments. And so if you're increasing the number of formative assessments, and that requires teachers to mark those formative assessments, the question then becomes is where do you find the time? And so if it just becomes a demand that the teacher must add on, a formative assessment every week, you're going to very quickly burn out teachers. And at the moment, we still have a teacher retention problem of young teachers coming into the system and burning out after 3 or 4 years and finding another career. And so I think time is the issue. Um, And so that's teacher time. There's also a time issue in the classroom because the time that it takes to go through formative assessment, you have to take, say, a lesson to do a formative assessment. That takes away from something that you could have been teaching the students. And so there's kind of like a time cost basis here where you're actually having to choose to remove content from the curriculum to be able to add in more formative assessments. And so there's a cost there as well, in what do we leave out and why do we leave it out? Um, the the second challenge I think with formative assessments is it's all very well to do more formative assessments, but we actually have to do something with those formative assessments to make them valuable. So if we don't do anything with a formative assessment, but we just put a number into a marks book, uh, it, it's not a formative assessment anymore. It's a summative assessment. And so the challenge then is, what are we going to do with a formative assessment? How do we take the information from the formative assessment? How does that make students' learning visible? How does that make it visible to the students? And then what do we do next? Because that's actually a difficult, complex process.
How might technology help deal with these challenges or support any work that's done in the summative or formative space?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think that technology. So we've been using Gradescope here for summative assessments at Carey Baptist College for, I think, not quite a year now. And what we're seeing there is, particularly for summative assessments, is we're increasing time savings in marking of assessments, and we're increasing the consistency of the marking of those assessments across classes. And so, we're already seeing technology helping us time saving for summative assessments. For formative assessments, I see real potential with program platforms like Gradescope, because what we can do is we can essentially use the inbuilt technology and the artificial intelligence to speed up the marking processes. So we can use the bubble sheets from Gradescope, so that when students are taking multiple choice tests, really all the teachers are doing is taking in the tests at the end of the lesson, scanning them through the system in a few clicks, and they've got the student results. And then they can use those results, and it's not really a major time cost for the teacher at that point. So the time cost then comes in, what are they going to do with the data, not collecting the data.
And with regards to the move towards more formative assessment, how can educators or teachers make formative assessment work for learning, knowing that there are challenges with, like you were pointing out, in some cases they've got to strip out parts of the curriculum so they can have time to
Mm.
do the formative assessment. But is that really a good solution? And what would you say are some ways they can make that formative assessment work for learning?
Yeah, so it's a question we've been asking here at Carey Baptist College. We've been asking a little bit um, about how do we make it work for us. And you're saying about stripping, you do have to make a decision to remove some content from a curriculum to make it work for you. And I think then what you're asking is, what is essential for the students to learn to build on? Because essentially, I think that teaching in a classroom, when we talk about the kind of the non-character building side of the teaching in the school, where we're actually wanting students to know more than they did yesterday, what we're doing there is we're building schema, and we're building schema of understanding. And so there's a lot that you teach at school, which is kind of nice to teach, but it's not essential for building schema. It kind of, what I talk to my student teachers about, what lives and dies in year seven, the stuff that it pops up in the curriculum in year seven, it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't link into anything that they need for the future. And so I think that it's about firstly, making decisions on what are we going to keep in the curriculum and what are we going to remove from the curriculum. And thankfully, I think in Australia, we've got a lot of choice around that. So our Australian curriculum is not overly prescriptive, and it allows us a lot of flexibility in that area, which I think it's a really good thing to have a very flexible curriculum. Then when we come to do formative assessments, I think that the big thing first that we need to do is we need to dislocate a student's sense of ego from the assessment. So when I talk about ego, is that the students need to almost be able to step back from this assessment to say that this isn't about my self-worth as an individual. This isn't an A or a B or a C. This is about me learning something from this information. And so as an example, I recently did a multiple choice quiz with a year 8 class. And it was a formative task. And I deliberately set up about 30 multiple choice questions, and I grouped them by 5. Each 5 questions was for a particular learning outcome. And then I got the students to write their answers in and then go through a self-marking process. and then give themselves a mark out of 5 for each of the pieces of the learning outcome questions. And in the classroom, I kept reiterating the narrative that it's not about the mark. It's about where are you strong and where are you weak. So what do you know already well, and what do you need to work on in terms of informing your study for the next week, your study at home for the next week. And even with an emphasis, even with no space on the sheet for them to write an overall mark, I still had students getting calculators out, calculating the whole mark. Oh, sir, I got 80% in this test. Is that an A? And I'm like, it doesn't, and I kept saying to them, it doesn't matter if it's an A or a B or a C. It's not about the grade. It's about how you're going in the assessment. And so it's a really hard thing to do to dislocate a formative assessment from a student's sense of self-worth, because they're always going to try to figure out where they sit, and they're going to look at their mark, and they're going to look at their friend's mark, and they're going to try and figure out what the class average was. And are they above average? Are they better than their friend? Are they worse than their friend? And so assessment is inherently an egotistical exercise for students. And so there's a lot of work to be done, I think, in building a culture of formative assessment is for learning, not for grades. And it's really hard to do because you're trying to do that in a system where students expect grades. And they want grades, right? They want, especially the students who are always getting A's. They just want to know if they got an A or not. And so it's a really hard thing to do. I think then secondly, the formative assessment needs something that informs the student or the teacher, right? So it's all very well to do formative assessment, but what are we going to do with the information? Because at the end of the day, formative assessment, it's a part of a feedback process. So it's part of us wanting to take information and feed that back into the learning process. And if we don't do that, then it's a follies exercise, really. We're just assessing for the sake of assessing. And so actually the big question then is to make it effective, we have to do something with it. And we have to feed back that information back to the student and back to the teacher.
So, just to wrap up, you've had this idea of an approach for using summative assessment formatively. Can you share with us while we wrap up today's episode?
First of all, with summative assessments it's almost impossible to strip a student's ego from a summative assessment. And so I think that it's the educational professor, Dylan William, has said that students, when they get a summative assessment, they'll look at two things, their mark and their friend's mark. And I think at our school, they look at a third thing, which is the class average. Are they above average or below average? And so I think that if you try to use the summative assessment in the format that it's presented in the test or an exam formatively, I think it's almost impossible to do. So you can try, and you could probably have a good crack at making that a formative process. But if the students can't dislocate their ego from the grade, a lot of research shows that the feedback that you give them just falls on deaf ears, because all they think about is the grade that they got. So I think to make summative assessments formative, what we need to do is we need to then present the information in a different format. So what we need to do as teachers is yes, the students get the test and they get their grade, that's fine. But can we then give them another document? So could we give them another document which presents how well they know the content in based on the different learning outcomes, and then maybe even allow a period of time between them getting their grades to then the teacher presenting them with another piece of information that allows them to analyze their learning in a way that isn't connected to their grades. And as a teacher, you don't even need to tell the students this is from your test. If you've done lots of formative assessments, you can say, look, this is a cumulative formative assessment and test, and this is how well we see you as understanding the content right now. And so the key is, I think, first of all, is we need to strip away the grades and almost dislocate the information we present from the test, because the students can't dislocate their ego from the test. And then we need to make it a reflective process. So for students particularly, one of our goals here at Carey is we want students to become reflective learners. And so as we present them with information from formative and summative assessments, we want them to then think through that information, process that information, and then make really good decisions based on the information. And as teachers, we're also looking at the whole class rather than the individual students. But then we're also making those decisions. So my big tip for making summative assessments formative is you've got to figure out how do we take the information from the summative assessment and then present it to the students in a way that doesn't look like a summative assessment.
It's all about presentation and actually tying it back to the learning outcomes. So I think that's a very interesting approach, and I'm curious to know who's starting to do it across Australia for a start, and maybe around the globe as well.
Yeah. So one of the things we've found with Gradescope is that uh, as we've been using Gradescope, one of the nice things is that the each question we can basically give it a title. And so we've been giving the questions titles based upon the learning outcome or the learning area that it's in. And then we can very quickly kind of figure out which questions are based on which contents. And then using sort of Excel and that sort of thing, we can very quickly manipulate that data and present it to students in a way that doesn't look anything like a test. It looks like, this is how well you understood balancing chemical equations, for example. And so using things like Gradescope helps us because without Gradescope, you're actually going to having to take tests and enter whole lots of pieces of information into a spreadsheet, which takes time. And then you got to figure out which question relates to which piece of content. So I actually think the way forwards with this is technology, and I think we're seeing some exciting opportunities with Gradescope.
Thanks for sharing your insight today. We are very pleased that you could share your insights with regards to formative and summative assessment. Looking at the secondary education landscape, we do appreciate your time today, and thank you again.
Thank you.